Although we're in the midst of one of the most hyped up and long-awaited arcs in One Piece with Wano, I believe that ELBAF has the potential to surpass even Wano and become the greatest arc in One Piece. And there are three main reasons of why I think that, which are the lore, the conflict, and the sniper. We'll be breaking all that down in this video, but first off, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you can join the King Pirates crew and not miss any future videos. Also, if you're having a good time watching this video, be sure to drop a like for the YouTube algorithm. Alright, but the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to ELBAF is the potential lore of the arc. When it comes to foreshadowed islands, the only islands that were introduced before ELBAF were Fishman Island, Laugh Tale, and technically Lodestar because it's what we thought was Laugh Tale this whole time. But besides those, there were really no other islands that were foreshadowed before ELBAF. Even Wano, despite the amount of hype it's gotten, wasn't introduced until Thriller Bark. ELBAF, on the other hand, was one of the earliest islands we were introduced to. We found out about it pretty much right after the Straw Hats got into the Grand Line. At the same time, I would say the main difference between ELBAF and something like Wano is that there hasn't been like a clear path of build up towards ELBAF, to the point where there's a lot of people that think ELBAF might not even happen. But in my opinion, I think there's no way ELBAF won't be an arc, and I think part of what makes it so interesting is that we don't really know too much about it. Like with Wano, even though we've never been there before and we didn't know what it was look like, we knew what the plot was gonna be heading into the arc. ELBAF, on the other hand, at this point, we don't really know when it's even gonna happen and what's gonna go down in that arc, and I think that mystery is gonna be incredibly exciting, even just entering the arc and exploring this new island, because ELBAF is a completely unique island that's home to the giant race, and it's these types of islands that really allow Oda to dig into his fantasy bag. Like, of course, Oda does a great job of designing every single island and making them very unique. He uses many real-life inspirations like Spain for Dressrosa, Venice for Water 7, ancient Japan for Wano, and by using these inspirations and combining some fantasy elements, he's able to create these beautiful worlds for just basic human societies. And while I really love those islands, like Water 7 is probably my favorite design in One Piece, I still think it's places like Skypiea and Fishman Island, these islands that are not possible in our regular world. Those are the islands that really allow Oda to get creative and make it really adventurous. Like the mysterious adventurous feel of getting to Skypiea and going up the Knockup Stream and finding a whole new world up there, or the journey down to Fishman Island and essentially discovering Atlantis. The other islands just don't have that same mystery fantasy element. And I think with ELBAF, Oda could once again get really creative with the fantasy elements and dive into some folklore inspirations. And even with the little information and quick glimpses we've gotten of ELBAF, we're already starting to see Oda plant some seeds. There's a very clear Viking aesthetic to the giants and their architecture. We also saw a scene of ELBAF that was like a mountainous view with what looked like a giant tree in the back, which most likely is basing off the Norse mythology inspiration of Yggdrasil. I don't know why I said that with an accent, I probably butchered that pronunciation, but those types of fantasy elements are what really makes ELBAF interesting. There's also the fact that this is the world that the giants live in, so everything's gonna be out of proportion. During the Big Mom flashback, we even saw that the wildlife was giant as well. So even with just the basic aesthetic and lore of ELBAF, I feel like it's gonna be a breath of fresh air that we haven't gotten in a while. And that's just the surface level stuff. What makes things even more interesting is the power structure, the culture, and the history. First off, the power structure I'm incredibly intrigued by, but that kind of leans more into the conflict topic, so I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the culture of ELBAF I also see playing a major factor in the story. This was something that got established pretty much right away when we found out about ELBAF when we met Dory and Broggy, and the strong culture and tradition of ELBAF has been a consistent theme every single time we learn more about it. As we saw with the Big Mom flashback, pretty much all the citizens of ELBAF live by a strong warrior's code and live with great honor, and there was also a very strong emphasis on that tradition and honor when we met Dory and Broggy. Not only with the two of them fighting for 100 years over a simple dispute, but also the commitment of Dory to keep fighting even when he got sabotaged by Mr. 3. So clearly that warrior's code is something all citizens of ELBAF follow very strictly, and what I really find interesting is that part of that kind of ties into religion. This was something that Dory and Broggy also explained, where there's supposedly that there's this god of ELBAF that passes judgment through battles and protects the right person. So although we haven't gotten too much information from ELBAF, the little information that we have, their strong culture and warrior's code has definitely been heavily emphasized. So absolutely expect that to be a major part of the plot. I can totally see it conflicting with Luffy's ideals, but I'm also just interested to learn more about it. Because they are so strong and heavy on this tradition, there's gotta be a reason why. And that I think is gonna tie into their history, which could be the most important and interesting part about ELBAF. One thing to remember about giants is that they have much longer lifespans, which on average are 3 times longer than regular humans. And because they live for a long time, not only are they probably better at preserving history, but also we could end up meeting characters that could tell us about what happened like 300 years ago. Another thing that ties into the giant Giants' ability to preserve their history is their strength. That's another thing that's been heavily emphasized with the Giants of ELBAF is how strong they are. The giant warrior pirates were infamous pirates that even the world government feared, and because ELBAF is a nation of giants, I'd expect that just like Wano, the world government just never touched them. Which means that just like Wano, they probably have a lot of important information that they can offer, and especially because of how close we are to the end of the story, we're definitely gonna find out a lot of critical information probably about the Void Century in ELBAF. And I'm not even gonna try to speculate what we could possibly find out about in ELBAF because that's a whole nother video I can make, but Oda's definitely already dropped some hints on how ELBAF could be connected to the Void Century. During the Big Mom flashback, we saw that the people of ELBAF celebrated the winter solstice, and as we've seen throughout the story, the theme of suns and moons has consistently been building up to be a major part of history. So I think the lore of ELBAF is not only going to be very interesting to explore, just as a mysterious fantasy, but I also fully expect that the lore will give us some critical information to the story. Like, even if you forget about the Void Century and the Ancient Kingdom, just a connection to the ancient giant race is incredibly interesting. It seems like we're starting to find out more information about it in Wano, but maybe it gets completed in ELBAF. And overall, I just feel like ELBAF is like this perfect island for the Straw Hats to have one last adventurous arc before the final endgame and they head to Lodestar and Laugh-Tale. So with just the lore of ELBAF, I think there's a lot of potential to the arc. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to carry an arc just based off the lore. You're going to need some conflict. And honestly, I think the conflict of ELBAF could go many different ways and all of them could be quite interesting. I think even in the worst case scenario where ELBAF is not a major big arc and more of a small arc, I still think it could be a very interesting, well executed small arc like Zoe. And that's because I think the potential conflict could be executed very well even in a smaller scale. And the first potential conflict I'm very interested in is Prince Loki. Because we've all heard the name Loki before. Whether it's Norse mythology or the MCU, the guy is not a good guy. So the fact that he was revealed that he was their prince and a person in power, that was a major red flag. Especially when the guy looks like this, there's no way he's a good character. So already I'm expecting Loki to be a villain and create some interesting conflicts. And with him being the prince, he's obviously gonna have a lot of power and the Straw Hats can't just go up against all the giants. So like always, there's probably gonna be some buildup of the Straw Hats exploring and gaining some allies. And luckily for the Straw Hats, they have already established some connections with ELBAF. The first people I think we need to consider are Oimo and Kashi, who are allies of the Straw Hats and should be back in ELBAF. The last time we saw them, they said they were just gonna stick around and help rebuild Water 7 for a while before heading back to ELBAF. And since then, it's been over 2 years, so they should be back there already. So I fully expect those two to be recurring characters and they should be allies to the Straw Hats. And then of course there's a connection to Dory and Broggy, which could gain them even more allies. And then I think the biggest factor is gonna be Hadrudin, who I think is kind of an underrated connection. Because the other people I mentioned, they're kind of just friends with the Straw Hats. Hadrudin, on the other hand, literally is serving under Luffy. So even if he doesn't show up in the arc, I still expect that connection to be a pretty big factor. Either that's gonna gain them even more trust and allies because people respect the new giant warrior pirates, or maybe it goes the other way and like piracy is frowned upon in ELBAF. Because after all, they do follow a very strict tradition and honor system, so it could turn out that these connections actually end up hurting the Straw Hats. So with all these connections and the potential conflict of Loki, I think even if Oda decides to make the arc smaller, it's still gonna be a bigger scale conflict that could be very well executed. But you gotta remember, that's assuming of what I think is the worst case scenario of ELBAF being a minor arc. On the other hand, I think there's a best case scenario where ELBAF is a major arc and we get some massive conflicts. Because as many people have speculated, there's a lot of different potential players that Oda could bring into that arc. Now first off, I just gotta remind you guys that everything I say here is just pure speculation. There's definitely a lot of different players that Oda could bring into the arc that I'm not gonna talk about. Like, I think it's very possible that the conflict at ELBAF could come from like the world government or the Marines. Maybe the revolutionaries could even make an appearance. There's a lot of stuff going around in the world right now after the Reverie. So I'm just warning you guys not to get caught up in a certain headcanon because there's a lot of different ways ELBAF could go. That being said, the number one person people have speculated about coming to ELBAF is of course Shanks. I talked about this several times in previous videos, so I'm not gonna go into too much detail, but there are many reasons Shanks could show up. Like, he also has Norse mythology inspirations just like ELBAF, and even just story wise, it does feel like it's the right time for Luffy to finally reunite with Shanks. Because Luffy is that guy now. He's Yonko level, he's literally going up against Yonko, he's become a great pirate. And I think it's about damn time we finally get to see Shanks. So yeah, personally I do think it's very likely that Shanks makes an appearance in ELBAF, and honestly just Shanks finally being in the arc is gonna take it to legendary status. I don't think there's another character with as little screen time as him that's anywhere near as popular as him. This man's been like consistently top 10 in popularity polls, and I'm not even sure he's been in 10 chapters of One Piece. So when Shanks finally shows up in the arc and we get to see Luffy Luffy and Shanks' reunion and we get to see how strong he actually is, honestly that alone is gonna shoot ELBAF into top 5 for some people. But of course if Shanks is gonna show up in the arc, he's not just gonna be there, he's gonna have a role to play. I think part of that is just gonna be providing us with even more information because he's connected to so many things. His backstory and his experience with the Roger Pirates, like what Roger told him that made him cry. Of course his history with Blackbeard, his mysterious relationship with the Gorosei. There's so much just in terms of information that Shanks could give that could add to the lore of ELBAF. Another thing I would love to see is a Davy back fight between the Red Hair Pirates and the Straw Hat Pirates, so that could add to the arc. But also what makes things even more interesting is that if Shanks is in the arc, he's also gonna impact the conflict because that now has to escalate. Because there's no way in hell that the villain for a post-Wano Straw Hat crew plus the Red Hair Pirates is just Loki. I don't care how many giants he's got, I'd be shocked if he was the only conflict. So if Shanks is in the arc, you're gonna have to up the other side as well to even out the conflict. Unless you're a Shanks is evil guy, which personally I'm not. But yeah, personally I think if Shanks is in the arc, you're gonna need other factors to even out the opposition. Of course other Yonko showing up is a popular choice, but once again, like I mentioned earlier, I don't think we should completely shut down the idea of like the Marines and the world government getting involved. But as of right now, I do think other Yonko showing up is the most likely option if Shanks is in ELBAF. And the first option we have to talk about is actually kind of an unpopular one, and that is Big Mom also showing up in ELBAF. Listen, I get it, at this point I'm kind of tired of her character as well, but we also have to be realistic with it. Taking down 2 Yonko in one arc is a pretty tough thing to do, and for me, I believe in the idea that Luffy will defeat Kaido and Big Mom, because not only did he say that he's gonna take down all 4 Yonko, but he did also have that moment with Big Mom back in Fishman Island where he said he was gonna defeat her. I don't think he's gonna be able to defeat both of them in Wano. That's pretty absurd. So when it comes to Big Mom, I just gotta be realistic with it. I think she could definitely show up in ELBAF, especially when she has a direct connection to the island. Not only did she cause a lot of trouble when she was a kid, but she also tried to arrange that marriage with Loki. And if Capone somehow gets involved in that arc and Lola is once again involved, that could be a way Big Mom and Loki ends up teaming up. And I think there's a way Oda could execute this really well, because when Big Mom is used properly as a villain, she's a terrifying menace. So I can definitely see Big Mom being a major villain in ELBAF as well. But if I'm gonna be honest, the idea I like the most right now is Blackbeard showing up to ELBAF. Now this is a topic I did an entire video on, so you can go check that out right here. But to kind of summarize, Ragnarok is a very famous event in Norse mythology, and also it was a conflict that Loki started. So because it's such a popular thing within Norse mythology, and ELBAF is based off of Norse mythology, and we already have Loki as a character, I could definitely see Oda drawing some inspiration from that event to use in the ELBAF arc. Now how Blackbeard ties into this, I have to admit, is kind of iffy. Essentially during Ragnarok, Loki used a big ship as a weapon, and here I'm kind of just loosely tying in the possibility that Blackbeard is going after ancient weapon Pluton. But also, to be fair, Blackbeard does have a very strong connection with Shanks. And another thing I think we should take into account is that we are in the Yonko saga, and unless the saga's not going to end with ELBAF, it'd be kind of weird if Blackbeard never shows up in the Yonko saga. So for me, Oda using Ragnarok and Blackbeard as well is probably the most fun idea. But like I mentioned, I think there's many ways Oda could execute this, and all of them are going to create some interesting conflicts for ELBAF. But guess what? There's still one more thing that can make this arc even better. Because sure, you can have an amazing conflict that makes the story interesting and some amazing lore to back that up, but the final thing to tie this arc all together and make it really memorable is the character connection. And in my opinion, the icon, the GOAT of character connection in One Piece is none other than the sniper god Usopp. He's the character the audience relates to the most human character within One Piece. The character that has so many up and downs and such realistic character development, and to this day, one of the biggest reasons why Water 7 plus Enies Lobby is a clear top 1 for me. And I think ELBAF could be the conclusion that wraps up the character development for Usopp, because from the moment we were introduced to ELBAF through Dory and Bragi, the person that was emphasized was Usopp. And time again, as we met more people like Oimo and Kashi, it was Usopp that interacted with them. Hadrudin was even the person that held him up as God Usopp. So just from everything that we've seen, ELBAF is clearly going to be an arc where Usopp gets a lot of focus. And I think that's even more evident when you look at this pattern of Oda giving the East Blue Straw Hats more shine in individual arcs. Sanji and Whole Cake Island, Zoro and Wano, Usopp and ELBAF, and in my opinion, Nami and Lodestar. But that I talked about in a separate video you can check out right here. But yeah, I think Usopp will get a lot of development in ELBAF, and I've talked about this in many videos because I'm so excited about it. And honestly, I think Oda is already slowly building up that character arc for Usopp. Because for a while now, Usopp's character has been very low-key. He wasn't in Whole Cake Island, and he hasn't done too much in Wano. And part of the reason is obviously Oda focusing on other characters, but I've also talked about the possibility of Oda setting up Usopp to enter ELBAF in a low point. I'm not gonna spoil details for anime only, friendlies, but so far in the manga, Usopp is very low-key, and my personal theory on why that's happening is Oda once again setting up Usopp's self-doubt. As we know with Usopp's character, his self-doubt and his low self-esteem is a major part of his development. We saw it reach a climax during Water 7, and since the post-time skip, he's gained more confidence. I think it's still very clear that he hasn't fully gotten over that, and everything ties back to his dream of wanting to become a brave warrior, which is really just him believing in himself and having that confidence. Because from the moment we met his character, he already showed that he was brave by putting his life on the line to save his village. If you guys are interested, I did a full analysis video on Usopp's dream right here. But yeah, I think in ELBAF is where we're gonna get back to this character development for Usopp, and this could definitely be the arc where he really figures it all out and gains that confidence, but it's not gonna be easy. As a matter of fact, I think the environment of ELBAF is actually gonna make Usopp feel even more pressure, because he's still gonna go in there as himself, scared of everything. Maybe he has even more lower self-esteem. Meanwhile, ELBAF has this very strong warrior culture that is focused on bravery and honor. So I can see a scenario where Usopp feels ashamed because he's so different from that culture. And the one thing I think could really tie this all together is Usopp reuniting with his dad, which is a real high possibility because if Shanks is there, Yasopp should be there as well. This is low-key the reunion I'm most excited for because there's so many different mixed emotions there. Yasopp, of course, is Usopp's idol, but personally, I think he's been a bad father. So if some conflicts arise, maybe there's some resentment there. On the other hand, because Yasopp abandoned his son, he doesn't really know Usopp at all. So obviously, Usopp is gonna lie his way around and Yasopp might believe that. But of course, you can't lie forever, and eventually Usopp will be himself and he might feel even more ashamed that he's not a brave warrior in front of his dad. And again, this is all speculation. Oda can go a completely different way, but I see so many different ways Oda can make this interesting. And one way or another, I see Usopp getting some great character development in this arc, giving us the personal connection that can make ELBAF the greatest arc in One Piece. Alright, anybody that watched the Squid Game, you should know the marble game. I don't have marbles, but I have coins, and you have to guess even or odd. If you guess wrong, you know the drill. You have to like, subscribe, and watch that video. The correct answer is odd.